Welcome to the first monthly UMP Urban Ministry Program webinar. It's great to see you guys. And we're going to kick it off tonight by looking at online preaching. And first off, I just want to say I'm not for a second claiming that I'm an expert on online preaching. Okay, just want to be clear about that. But it is something that I've spent a bit of time thinking about. I've definitely spent plenty of time having doing all sorts of technical experiments with the technology side of things to see how it works, and done some thinking about the communication side of things. So I want to share all of that with you today. And having just mentioned the technical side of things, I should also let you know that my mouse has just frozen. My mouse isn't working, and I have a backup mouse, and my backup mouse has also stopped working. Okay, so I'm just going to do something quick. All right. Now that my mouse is working, let's try this again. So online preaching, right? This is what we're going to look at. First, we're going to look at the tech, what technology, what are some of the technological things to think about. Second, we're going to talk about tone. When we're doing online preaching, what kind of tone do we want to use? And thirdly, we'll look at how do we actually prepare a message to deliver online. And I'll share with you a technique that I'm presently using to prepare a message. And then if we have time, number 4, we'll do Q&A. So let's get into it with the tech. So you all know this. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 9, Paul said, "Unless you speak intelligible words with your tongue, how will anyone know what you're saying? You'll just be speaking into the air." And you could say, look, Duncan, I think you're grasping a bit with this verse, but I do actually think there is a point here that we don't want our online preaching to just be speaking into the air and people at the other end can't hear us. And as I've been listening to different people preaching online the last few weeks during lockdown, I've noticed that some guys are hard to hear because of their tech. And I've ended up switching off because I found them hard to hear. So let's talk about some things that can make ourselves easier to hear. And if you already know this, sorry if this just seems pretty basic to you, but if you're using Zoom and if you're preaching through the Zoom app, there's some audio settings that can make a big difference. So if you go to audio in your Zoom settings, and this will be if you're using it on a computer, by the way, which is going to work better than using it on a device in terms of how many settings you have. You want to click on this first one, which says show in meeting option to enable original sound from microphone. This means that when you're in your Zoom meeting, in the top left of the screen, you have a thing to enable original audio. And if you got that turned on, and I'm really hoping mine's turned on right now, but if it's not turned on, then what happens is that Zoom processes the audio that comes from your mic and it plays with it and it tries to make it sound better. But in the process, it often makes stuff sound worse. So you want to use your original sound from your microphone if you can. Okay, now next it says suppress persistent background noise. You really want that disabled. You don't want that on. What that means is that if you've got a fan on, so like now I've got a fan in my room, I'm going to turn it on. Now I don't know if you can hear that fan chugging away. Oh, it feels quite nice actually. It gets very hot in this room. Now if I turn this on, Zoom will, as in the suppress persistent background noise, Zoom will try to kill the noise of that fan in the background. And you might think, well, that's a good thing, but it's not, because it sounds terrible. It sounds absolutely horrible. So you're better off just turning your fan off whilst you're preaching. Have the fan on during the worship, turn it off when you're actually preaching. The next one says suppress intermittent background noise. So that is if you've got someone doing the washing up in the background like I do right now, and they just dropped a spoon or something, and I heard it in this room. I don't know if you guys heard it, but you don't want that turned on again, because it will be processing your voice the whole time, trying to compensate for any background noises, and in the process it makes your voice sound a bit robotic and very low quality. It's much better instead to get like a mic like this, which is really close to your mouth, The closer it is to your mouth, then the better the ratio between how close the mic is to your mouth and how far away it is from background noise. Which is why for a lot of people, it's well worth preaching with one of these, earbuds with a microphone right here. It's well worth doing that. But bear in mind, these use if I can block my face to try and get that in focus. They use a TRRS thing. There's 3 lines on this, not 2 lines. So it's not going to plug into every single socket you can find in all your devices. It will only work in some. Like if you use Apple products, this will work in a MacBook, and it will work in your iPad, and it will work in your iPhone. But it's not necessarily going to work in your like Dell laptop. But there's ways around that. You can buy adapters, TRRS to TRS and so on. You can get adapters for that. Okay, next one is echo cancellation. You can't turn it off, unfortunately. You can only put it on auto. Auto is the best setting. And what that means is that when voices are coming out of your speakers and then gets picked up by your mic, you get double sound, you get an echo, and it tries to compensate for that. What I do instead is I will either just use earbuds instead of speakers, or right now I'm using speakers, but I've got the volume turned right down. And as soon as someone starts speaking and I now want to hear what they're saying, then I will just turn the volume up and listen like that. Okay, so those are some pretty basic settings there that will help your audio in Zoom sound better. Now, next one, video settings. Okay, check this out. You probably already know this, but in your video settings in Zoom, you want Enable HD turned on, because if you don't, Zoom by default will broadcast your picture quality in a lower resolution. So it will broadcast you in 1080p, but only if you click on Enable HD. So you definitely want that turned on. Now, you see, I haven't turned on the thing that says touch up my appearance. You really don't want to turn on touch up my appearance, right? Yes, it might make you look younger if that is what you are looking for, but it looks proper weird. It makes your face look all plasticky and stuff. It's better to turn it off, and that will look better. Okay, now check it out. What about where you're going to put your camera? You can see on my screen here where I put my camera, right? I've got my camera right at the top of my monitor, and that means if I want to look at you and really connect with you, I'm actually looking at my camera lens. And right now I'm looking at my camera lens, but now if I look down to the PowerPoint on my screen, you see what happened there? It doesn't look like I'm really connecting with you on the same way anymore. So it's important, if you're doing this, whatever you got on your screen, don't keep staring at it. If you've got notes on your screen or something, if you can get them a bit higher up nearer the top of your screen, then see, right now I'm still not looking at the camera lens, but I'm looking at the top of my screen and it doesn't look as bad. And then if every now and then you can look up and actually look directly at that lens, you'll be able to connect with people much better. And what this also means is that some of you might want to put your camera on, or your laptop on, a stack of books or your iPad, because too many people at the moment, I can see in the group right now, everyone's perfectly positioned, so that's wonderful, but too many people right now are preaching with the up the nostril shot, and that is really bad news. Like, no one wants to see the up the nostril shot. So as much as you can, get your camera at eye line. Okay, now this is something I would suggest. If you're like really young, you don't need this because you'll remember this. But if you're at the stage I'm at where you start forgetting things, you might want to have a checklist so that before you go to preach, you actually have a tick list where you check, are my Zoom settings on the right settings? And then you check, have I got my lighting right? And I would really suggest that everyone make sure they've got some lighting when they're preaching, and the lights need to be in front of them. And if you don't wear glasses, then happy days, because lighting is so much easier when you haven't got glasses. But once you've got glasses, as you can see, it does make it much harder getting the light into your eyes and without having too much shadow and stuff. Try to watch out for having a light that is only at the bottom and is shining up at your face. It casts some serious shadows, which is great if you're going for sort of a horror movie look, but in your sermon you probably don't don't want that. So I have two lights at the moment on either side coming down, and you can see the downside of that is I've got two shadows behind me, but I just decided I don't care about the shadows. There are ways to get rid of the shadows, but it's kind of hard. And I'm like, I don't think the shadows really matter too tough for a sermon, but the lighting is important. And especially if you've got a low quality webcam, the better the lighting, the better the quality your image is gonna look. So make sure you got some lighting. And if you're preaching in the daytime, which most of us are, consider whether you want your curtains open or closed. So I actually close my curtains because I find when I leave the curtains open, 1 minute you get loads of sun shining through, the next minute you get a cloud, and it keeps going light and dark and light and dark. So I like to just close the curtains, and I like to just have the natural light. If you are using your window light, make sure that your window light is actually shining on you and not shining behind you, because that tends to cause problems. Okay, now let's talk about mic position. I touched on this before. I love it when you can have a mic like this, which is really close to your mouth. What I think is also quite cool is you can buy USB mics these days that you could just plonk on your desk and you could plug into USB. And some of those have amazing quality. Sounds like someone on a radio station. Now, I do actually have a proper like condenser mic that if I wanted to go for the radio station sound, I would. So if I just bring this in the picture so you can see. So you see, I've got one of these. But the reason why I don't use this is because I feel like it creates a little bit of a barrier with people. And I like to move my hands, and I don't really like this in the way. So I prefer to have a mic like this. Okay, camera position. Say these are things I'm suggesting you'd have on your checklist. You'd be like, mic position. Have I put it in the right place? Zoom settings, you might want to check. Have I got it on the right mic? Because check it out. I did a whole thing once where I thought I was using this mic, and the whole time I was recording from my webcam's built-in mic, and that was a bit frustrating. But camera position, like I showed you with the previous one, make sure that your camera position is as much to eye level as possible so that you're really normal connecting with people. Okay, that is all the stuff on technical stuff. We're about to move on to tone, but what I'm going to do first is I'm just going to see, have any of you got any questions? And just, shout out the questions if you do.
I'm good. Just one thing I did notice, you put your mic right in front of you as opposed to mine, which is on the side. Do you think that makes a difference with the condenser?
Yeah, definitely does. So with a condenser mic, you definitely want to be as what was called on axis as possible. Now, there are situations where you want to go off axis, which is if you're getting a lot of sibilance. So if you're getting a lot of sibilance, you might want to go at a bit of an angle, but not too much. Not too much. But what I would say is anyone who's using a condenser mic, just go online and Google condenser mic placement, and you find a whole bunch of stuff. Because the placement affects stuff. So for example, proximity effect, if you're talking to a condenser like this, you get lovely bass sound in your voice. And the further back it goes, the less bass you got. If you want to sound like a talk show guy, then you want to be as close to your mic as possible and as on axis as possible. But you can get away with being off axis. You can, but you just want to be aware there will be a difference in sound. Okay, right. Well, the technical stuff, apologies if it's stuff that people are like, look, we've all worked this out in the last few weeks anyway. So let's now move on to tone, okay? What is the tone we're going to use when we're preaching? And, when we started the Urban Ministry program in 2013 and did the preaching course, this was a big question that people had, is what tone should we have? And I just want to look at Paul in 1 Thessalonians 2, verses 6 to 7. He said, we were not looking for praise from people, not from you or anyone else, even though as apostles of Christ, we could have asserted our authority. Instead, we were like young children among you, just as a nursing mother cares for her children. So I just want to point out his tone when he was at Thessalonians. He wasn't asserting his authority. He was acting like a nursing mother taking care of children. So you get the impression that it's quite a gentle tone. Now, obviously, in Paul's ministry, there were different seasons and different reasons for different tones at different times. But I just wanted to share this because I think sometimes when we think about preaching, we think about kind of, the old school preachers like belting out their voices, and we think we have to preach like that. And I want to suggest that with online preaching, we don't have to. It might be okay to do that, but we don't have to take that tone. There's a time and place for a gentler tone. And I started noticing more and more how much building affects your tone when our church changed buildings. So we used to be in a big echoey youth club, which was like a basketball hall we were meeting in. And when you preached in that, you really had to raise your voice. You really had to fill the room, and you really had to inject a lot of energy because it was such a cold, empty hall. But then after that, we moved into this small little community center, which is kind of like a small pub. And when you're in there, you're just chatting to people like in a gentle way. Like if you started preaching with a big forceful voice, it would feel really weird. And I found that when I went in that room and started preaching, I just naturally started talking in a quieter way and a more gentle way. And then last summer, I was preaching at the Keswick convention, and I'm in this ginormous marquee, and I think there was, someone told me the numbers were something like 4,000 people. I don't know if that was everyone in the marquee and including the overflows or everyone just in the marquee, but it was a ton of people. And what I found was that when you got up on the stage and started preaching, you just started vibing off all the people there, and you had so much energy, and you could just preach in a way that was just full of life and vitality and just energy, where it was a bit like what you see with those stand-up comedians at the Royal Albert Hall or whatever, and they're walking back and forth along the stage and they got loads of energy and the crowd are loving it. And funny thing was, I preached the exact same sermon pretty much at Keswick that I'd preached a week earlier at my local church in this tiny community hall. And the tone of the two sermons was totally different, and the vibe and the energy of the two sermons was totally different. And that's totally okay, because the context determines the tone that feels right to the people who are there. So I think the Daily Show, Trevor Noah does the Daily Show, right? And it's put on YouTube. And since lockdown with COVID-19, Trevor's been doing it back at his place. As you can see in this picture here, this is what his show looks like. There he is. He's sitting there with his hoodie. He hasn't had a haircut for a few weeks. And he's just talking to the camera, and he's talking in a normal voice. He's not talking like he'd talk if he was walking up and down a stage at the Apollo or something like that. He's just talking comfortably in front of the camera. You sort of feel like you're in his living room listening to him. And I think it works really well. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying this is how everyone should do online preaching. But what I'm saying is that a lot of people right now are used to hearing people like Trevor Noah on YouTube talking to people in this way. But something that I think is a little bit odd is when people are standing up in front of their laptops and preaching in their living rooms. Now, no disrespect to anyone who's doing that, but it is a little bit weird. Now, I don't know if you can hear the noises, but I have a dinosaur outside my room. So I'm just going to text someone to just ask if the dinosaur could move to another area. I think if you really feel that it's appropriate for your church to stand in front of your camera and preach like this, and even to have a lectern in front of you, then fine, go for it. If you think that's the right thing, I'm just suggesting that during lockdown, you will come across a lot more natural, and it's a lot more easy for people to pay attention to you if you're actually sitting in front of the camera and chatting to people. Because when people are in their living rooms, I think they're just more used to having a conversation with someone who's sitting down in their living room, as opposed to, standing up in front of them and preaching type thing. Okay, now on that, any questions? anything.
Do you feel when you're doing stuff over Zoom, should be speaking quicker, slower than normal?
Wow, that's a good question. That's a great question. I'm not too sure, but what I have been doing is actually speaking a bit quicker when I've been on Zoom, because I'm aware that people's attention spans aren't as good. All the studies that are done on attention spans are pretty dire. Some of us might remember years ago being told how attention spans were like 45 minutes and stuff. Now studies are saying like 12 seconds and stuff like that. So, on YouTube, people are so quick to just change the channel, as it were. I'm finding myself talking a bit quicker, wanting to get through to people as quick as possible. And do you know what? I don't even know if that's effective or not. But I know that back in our community hall, when I was speaking, I felt like I could take my time more, look around the room, see where people were at, see if people were taking it in or not, and adjusting my pace based on what vibe I got from people. I think that's harder to do with Zoom. So with Zoom, I just tried to keep it a bit more punchy, because I know that on a Sunday, if we're tired, if we start our talk being kind of tired and slow, we almost infect people with our tiredness and then make them not feel as switched on.
Duncan, I've got a question. On tone, yeah, because on Sunday we're gonna go back. We're gonna be meeting with the new COVID guidelines, but we're live streaming as well. So feel free to park this for later. But just thinking about how I can strike that balance, because I've got viewers at home and I've got people in front of me.
Yeah, that's a great point. If you've got live streamers and you're preaching live, I would say focus on how you are preaching to the people in front of you. It will sound more natural then for the live streamers, but I would also suggest give a head nod to the live streamers along the way so that they don't feel like they're totally ignored. All right, let's move on to message prep now. And I'm going to share with you how I'm preparing my messages at the moment. I'm not suggesting you should do the same, but I just want to share with you what's helpful for me. So I am using PowerPoint, although really I'm using Keynote because I use a Mac, but I say PowerPoint because in common vernacular, that's what everyone understands. So I use PowerPoint, right? And if you look at, say, like my first screen here, I will have a title screen. So this was a talk I gave a few days ago to a group who were just graduating somewhere. And the title was Watch Yourself, 1 Timothy 4:16. And if you look at the presenter notes at the bottom, and this is just as I'm preparing it, notice the very first thing there says FCF. So I'd already worked out what the FCF was, right? And here I said, because of the fall, we have hearts that harden too easily. Part of this hardening leads to a focus on doctrine without a focus on our hearts and lifestyle. So I had my FCF, right? Now, sometimes for those of you who've done my stuff on the FCF before, and if you haven't, by the way, I've got a video that you can watch later to see what this FCF is, which is the fall and condition focus. Sometimes I will even in here write down all the different FCFs for all the different people who live in my neighborhood and just come up with loads of FCFs. And then at the end, I'll say, this is the final FCF I've picked. But if you do that, when you share your screen, make sure you have your presenter notes hidden. Because you don't want someone seeing the FCF that you've put in for them, right? You don't want them to see that. That's a good way to offend someone before you've started your sermon. Okay, so if you've done any of my preaching courses in the past, you know I do my intro with an F, an E, a B. The F is for FCF, the E is for empathy, and the B is for Bible. And you can see in my notes here, I've done an F in bold. And what I do, I just type up the kind of thing I'd say. So here I said, in the last few years, I've seen a few church leaders cover up sex abuse, bullying people, committing adultery, etc. We have a pandemic of bad character in Christian ministry. Okay, that's where I'm explaining to people what the FCF is. then you might notice I've put a B instead of an E, and you might be like, Duncan, what are you doing? It's supposed to be Feb, it's supposed to be FEB. But you see, what after a while you just start mixing it up a bit. And I decided in this case I would go to the Bible first, right? And I would say, you might just think it's a few bad apples, but the Bible encourages us to look within and consider our own bad character. And then I go to the E, I go to the empathy, and I talk about my heart and how I have the potential to cause terrible harm in ministry. And then I go back to the B again, and I say, so we're going to look at 1 Timothy 4:16. So what I do is I put my title on the screen, and then I just type what I'm going to say for the intro. But I'm not typing this like how I'm going to say it word for word. I'm just jotting down how it comes to me the first time I think about it. And then I'm gonna leave it there. What will happen is later I'll run through these PowerPoint slides and I will read out what I've written there under F, B, E, and B. I'll read it out. And then the next time I go through it, I won't read it out. I'll just freestyle it because I already come up with the idea once. Then I typed it out. Then I read it out. That's 3 times. So the next time, if I'm an authentic bloke who actually knows what he's talking about here, then I should be able to just explain it to people without even having to look at my notes. And when I explain it without looking at my notes, it's actually going to come out more natural. It's going to sound more like I'm just chatting to someone in their living room. Okay, so then this is what I do. The first verse that I'm preaching on, I will put it up on the screen like here, 1 Timothy 4:16. And notice I only underline the bit that I'm going to talk about. Okay, so here I've just underlined, keep a close watch on yourself. And if you look in the notes at the bottom, and by the way, these are the presenter notes. I do not display these when I'm preaching. Okay, they only see the top half. But if you look at the bottom half, you can see I've got my ELP, my ELPP. Now, apologies if you haven't done a preaching course with me before, but those videos are online and you can see what the E, the L, the P and the P is about. It's basically a system that I use called ELP, We Need Jesus. It's a system I use for communicating sermons. And so here you can see I've put the E. This is what we're told to do to ourselves, to keep a close watch on ourselves, to spy on ourselves, to put ourselves under observation. So I'm explaining just the underlined bit of text. And then I got my L. Sadly, this is where I link it to the FCF. I say, sadly, there's a school of thought that says to not think much about your emotions or things bothering you. Just get on with preaching the Bible. Preach the Bible, it says. But the Bible actually says keep a close watch on yourself. So I've got my L, my link to the FCF. And then I've got my P, a picture. There's a danger of thinking the danger's out there. There's heretics out there. There's dodgy people out there. Looking out the window of binoculars to see all the bad threats out there when the whole time sin's going on in our own hearts. And then I've got another P. Think of Jesus noticing the people. Now you're thinking, what do you mean noticing the people? This is actually my second slide of the sermon. The first slide showed that the Greek word epeko from keep a close watch is what Jesus used when he was at a party type thing, a meal, and he noticed people were taking the places of honor. So I'd already explained that to people. He's looking at people, he's sussing them out. That's what that means, this close watch business. And then I've got another P, another picture, which is when you're, or more of a practice actually, when you're serving the church, what's going on in your heart. Right, now, so this is my ELP. I write this out first, and then I say to myself, what do I need to put on my screen so that I can communicate all that without looking at any notes? Because whilst it's totally fine to use notes, we do tend to be more engaging when we don't use notes. And so what I've done is I just put a bunch of pictures on my screen that remind me of all those points, right? So I've got the picture of the bloke with binoculars looking out the window, right? And so I first thing I do when this slide comes up is I read out the underlined bit, then I explain it, and I can do my E quite easily because hopefully I've spent time exegeting the verse and understanding it in my homework. So I explain what it means, and then I look at the picture of the bloke with binoculars, and then I say, do you remember that? Hello, I'm Michael Payne and I'm a nosy neighbour. Like, do you remember that guy? Like, he'd have binoculars at his window and he'd be talking about the neighbour's lifestyle. And then I'd share, we tend to focus on other people's issues, but the Bible tells us to keep a close watch on ourselves. And then, now that I've said that, I look at the next picture and I'm like, oh, this is Jesus and the guys at the table. And then I say, it reminds me to say, the same level that Jesus did, looking at those guys and clocking that they were taking the best seats of honor, we're supposed to have that same level of analysis in our own lives, thinking about what's going on in our hearts. And then I look at the next picture and I see the "just preach the Bible" slogan I put there. And I say, some people say just preach the Bible and everything else will fall into place. And it sounds good, except that if you are going to preach the Bible, we've also got to listen to it. And when we listen to it, it tells us keep a close watch on yourself. So we need to preach the Bible and keep a close watch on ourselves. And then I look at my next picture, the serve picture, and it reminds me, oh yeah, hey guys, how about this? Next week, as we're serving one another, let's be thinking about what's going on in our hearts. What kind of motives are going on? Are there any bad motives going on as we serve one another? So on that slide there, you can see how I've got everything to preach without notes. Now, you could argue, actually, that is notes. It is a form of notes, but it's visual notes which enable me to still use the voice that I normally communicate with people in. And other times, say like the next slide, notice how the underlying text is now the next bit. So here I would say, okay, so it says, keep a close watch on yourself. And the next bit says, and on the teaching. And the cool thing about this as well, everyone in our church, they get used to this format. They see these slides every week, so it helps them to stay along. And I think it helps people to stay engaged in a world where it's so easy during an online service to say, I'm just going to get up and have a cup of tea or something. And here I haven't got any pictures, but I've made a list of old men, older widows, young men, young women. And it reminds me, oh yeah. And I say, it's interesting when Paul says, keep a watch on your teaching, because look at his teaching in 1 Timothy. And his teaching is covering all the different people that were in the church there and all the issues they would face. And what that means is we got to keep an eye on our teaching. Do we teach in a way that deals with the needs of all the different people in our church groups? Like recently, a lot of churches have been talking about racism because of the Floyd McClung, getting tongue-tied here, situation. And rightly so, but if it's the first time we've talked about racism, then that means we needed to have been watching our teaching a bit earlier, because the Bible says a lot about it. And we should have all kinds of people in our church who need to hear what the Bible says about racism. Okay, and then you see from my next slide, I have the next bit of text, persist in this, and now I've underlined that. So that reminds me, okay, the next bit to focus in is the next bit of the verse. And again, I've got a picture there about plateauing. So it reminds me to say something along the lines of, there's a temptation to plateau, to think, I'm holy enough now, I can stop. The Bible tells us to avoid that. And so this is basically how I will prepare a message. I'll prepare a message with preparing my PowerPoint at the same time that in the presenter notes at the bottom of my PowerPoint, I'm actually typing in my ELPs. And then at the end, any of you done my preaching courses know there is the crescendo to Christ. So here I'll put a bunch of pictures to remind myself, and I'll be like, think about it. Adam and Eve needed to keep a watch on themselves, and they walk with God every day. So how much more do we need to keep a watch on ourselves? And then think about Moses. Like, Moses was the most humble man ever, and he met with God face to face. God would speak to him face to face. And yet there was a time where he needed to watch his heart because he struck that rock in anger and he misrepresented God. And as a result, he didn't get to go in the promised land. So if Moses could fall in that way, how much more do we need to watch our lives? And then King David, who abused Bathsheba and had a husband killed, and yet he was a man after God's heart. So how much more do we need to guard our hearts? And then you've got the Apostle Peter, and then Jesus. And think about this. Jesus, on the cross, he dealt with every single sin that we need to guard our hearts about. And what that means is that we got the freedom to examine our hearts, and when we find ugly stuff, to share it with a friend and say, do you know what? I've realized there's some bad sin I'm caught up in right now, and I realize Jesus took it at the cross. And I want to share it with you so you can help me deal with this and grow in the way Jesus wants me to. So that those pictures there on the screen just help me do that crescendo to Christ. I didn't actually quite do it right of how I did it in my sermon there. But if you've practiced it on the same day that you're preaching it, then you'll find you'll be able to do it quite well, I think. So that is how I prepare my notes. Let's now bring it on to Q&A. But before we do general Q&A, has anyone got any questions about preparing the sermon?
No, that's good, Duncan.
Not a question, more an observation. I've found with the slideshows, whether that's been online or at church, I found it a lot easier to follow along with the sermon when I'm seeing it.
Cool.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that actually, because I was thinking that might be helpful for people generally anyway, like even if you're not online preaching, have you done that like just normally? I'm thinking of our guys, we've got loads of people from Iran, the English isn't great, and actually if we had the slide on with the underlining, that might really help people just catch each point.
Yeah. By the way, I just noticed that on Zoom I didn't have my turn on original sound from the microphone on, so I've just changed that. So if anyone earlier was like, well, the audio sounds bad, that's why. And that's why you need a checklist. But yeah, no, you're right. I found that I do this when we're meeting in the hall as well. I found there was a time period where PowerPoint got overdone in churches and it got used in a bit of a bad way. I found this way, I think, works well. Feedback I've had from people, as you just heard from Gary, people have said that it helps. People find themselves following along. And so I think it works online and offline. But of course, it will totally depend on who you've got there. You know, so you guys really are the experts of your context. You know whether this would work for your context or not, and you know whether you'd need to actually tweak it and change it a bit.
Have you sort of deliberately shortened your sermons or lengthened them? I don't know what people's concentration has been like. You touched on that a bit earlier.
That is a great point. So before COVID-19, I'd started shortening my sermons because we were getting a good number of unchurched people, and I wanted to make them shorter. Whereas back in the day in our church, we had people, you know, I would preach for up to an hour. And I remember one young guy once said, look, I don't watch TV anymore. So like I come to church expecting a big sermon, you know, and we had people who are real hungry for that. But the more and more unchurched people we got, the more I was like, let's keep it short. But packing a punch, like not short as in we missed the gospel out or we missed out, you know, getting gritty with the text. But then when we went to online preaching, originally I just did 10-minute sermons. And then over time, I found myself going up to like 30-minute sermons. And I don't really know, to be honest, if I'm keeping people or losing them. So sometimes if I'm doing online stuff like now, I can see your faces. And I like that because I can gauge are people with me or not. But what I found with the online sermons are much harder than webinars, and you've got to have a lot more concentration. And what I found with the online sermons now, I don't actually want to see people's faces because there's too many distractions. So you got someone sitting there with their children and their children start asking them questions and they start talking to them. There's nothing wrong with them doing that at all, by the way. So I don't want anyone who's hearing us suddenly thinking like, oh, Duncan doesn't like us doing it. I'm not saying that for a second. What I'm saying is when I see that, I just find myself get a little bit distracted. Or one of you was actually, I know you won't get offended by this. One of you was in our Sunday service on Sunday. And at one point I looked up to say, in fact, the way I have my screen with the PowerPoint, I actually looked to the side to see where people are. And I looked to the side and I saw one of you like this. And for a split second, I was like, is this sermon totally terrible? And then I was like, do you know what? He's probably just got a headache. But then suddenly I'm like, well, what am I doing? I'm in the middle of a sermon. You know, them times where you're preaching and you find your brain drifting and you're suddenly like, what am I doing? I'm supposed to be doing my sermon right now. So I actually find it easier to just be looking at the text or looking at the lens and kind of ignoring people. But the minus of that is I can't gauge at people paying attention. But for me personally, when I see people get up and go and make a cup of tea, I do find it hard to keep communicating well, because I just feel so distracted by that. So, and again, I'm not dissing people who get up and make a cup of tea. I realize it's very different to in a church service, but I find it distracting. So really, I guess we have to ask other people in our church how they have found the time thing. But in general, my principle is however long the text takes to explain it well is how long the sermon needs to be. So if you can explain it well and point people to Christ in 10 minutes, then job done. If it takes 40 minutes, then that's just what it has to be. But as long as we keep it engaging, we keep people with us. So that's one of the reasons why I like to keep the PowerPoint. I put the pictures in. I like to tell a lot of stories, give a lot of illustrations to keep it engaging. And so I hope I'm bringing people along. But I think you guys would be the experts on your context about who is, how long people can handle. Any other questions? What about, is there anything that anyone has found has worked well for them when they've been doing online preaching?
I think you touched on it a little bit, but just ask your people what they would like, because obviously you had a discussion, didn't we, Duncan, about possibly sitting down, and I spoke to people, and it was more, I think they'd prefer me to stand up, and I don't know where that's come from, but it's just it was just kind of, they weren't too bothered about if I was sat down or stood up. But if it was a choice, it was kind of, they're used to seeing, I guess it's because they're quite, our congregation are quite churched anyway, and they're used to seeing someone stood up at a pulpit. And because I'm with you, I do think it is strange standing in your living room talking to a camera with a music stand. It's so weird. But just speaking from our context, the people we've got were basically saying that it's a sermon, so we want to see someone stood up preaching a sermon. But I guess it is, like you say, I think it's just finding out what your people want as well, and asking questions and not being afraid to do that as well. Yeah, great. Yeah, excellent. So I guess we all need to do our market research to find out what works well. One thing I didn't mention was that once a month we have an all-age service. And when we do that, then I do actually like to see people, because I like to actually ask the young people questions during the sermon. So I like to be able to see them and ask them to unmute themselves to answer the question. And it's really helpful to then see people during that time as well, because say like if a parent's struggling with their child with something, sometimes you can help them out by asking their kid a question. But also sometimes you can see that if you ask a question, it's going to cause drama. It's going to make life harder for the parent. So sometimes you think, oh, I'm about to ask them a question, but I can see mum's really struggling right now. So I just
leave them for a minute, come back to them later. So the all age services I do in a different way. I still like to use PowerPoint, but I like to actually look at people and suss them out and ask questions, get them talking back to me and so on. Anything else anyone's found helpful?
I think whatever you're comfortable with, really, you know, I mean, I've stood up, but the camera's just showing my top half. So obviously, as you said, I've raised my laptop. So, you know, I'm comfortable standing up rather than sitting down, but my laptop is raised up. So probably they're not quite sure whether I'm sitting down or standing up anyway. And, you know, it's helpful, you know, after you've done a service, if people feed back to you. So not necessarily asking them, but, you know, if somebody gets back to you, you might get a bit of feedback. But yeah, quite rightly so, as you said, the tone of voice and the setting, the notes and everything, and yeah, the eye contact. So yeah, really, you do need to prepare yourself that you feel comfortable in delivering the service.
Yeah, excellent point about.
Sorry?
Yeah, I totally agree with you, bro, about what is comfortable for you, because that's really key. Like the stuff I said about sitting down, if you find that you're not comfortable sitting down, then don't do the sitting down thing. You know, funny thing for me is, from being in a wheelchair so long, when the first Sunday I tried preaching without a wheelchair, I was standing up, and I felt so self-conscious about standing up. And afterwards I actually said to people, I said, was that okay? Like, it felt weird. And they were like, what do you mean? And I said, I felt like I was above you lot, like I was preaching down to you. And I was like, for years I've been at the same eye level with you lot, and it felt so weird. So I was like, it was also very painful for me standing up. So I was like, forget that. For me, sitting is more comfortable. But if for you, standing is more comfortable, you're going to be a more natural communicator that way.
Yeah, I think for us, you probably would be a little more comfortable sitting down, because you've preached many a time sitting down, right? So said people adapting to doing services in their house sitting down, probably, yeah, it might take a bit of while for them to, you know, sit down. It's not what we're really used to, but yeah, you just need to be comfortable in whatever position it is. Yeah.
Got any wisdom on for all age services? Anything that's worked particularly well with kids? Obviously, just in terms of like sort of technique.
Yeah. So in general, I find asking questions really helps engage the different ages, and asking the lower level questions for the younger kids and the higher level questions for the higher kids. So, you know, for the 4-year-olds, saying like, and what was the name of Cain's brother? You know, they can shout out Abel. But also, if you've got unchurched kids, giving them the answers first, so that you're actually in the story saying, so there's 2 brothers, Cain and Abel, okay? And what happens is, and then you say, now, does anyone remember what's the name of Cain's brother? Because then if someone's never heard the story before, they can answer it, and they don't suddenly feel like, oh, I'm sick of all these church kids getting that answer right. But then for the older kids, saying stuff like, yeah, how would you feel if you were Cain? Would you be a bit miffed? You know, and then ask someone like, how do you think you would feel? You know, and then, or how do you think Cain felt? And then the older kids tend to prefer answering those questions because they're not patronizing. Whereas if to a 14-year-old you say, and what's the name of Cain's brother? You know, they might be like, forget you, I'm never coming to this thing again, you know. I'm going to go on my PlayStation. Oh, and the other thing I'd say with the all age thing is I still do the FCF technique with the all age thing as well. So I still try to have it FCF driven, but I just particularly think of what is the fallen condition focus for young people in this Bible passage, so that it's hitting them at their hearts as well. But that also means talking to young people in the week to learn where they're at, because you get to that shocking point, don't you, where you discover that young people don't think the same way that you thought when you were young. And you suddenly realize that you've got to do more research for your sermon prep. All right, well, look, let's call it a day there. So it's been great interacting with you guys, and I hope that there's at least one thing that you might be able to take out of tonight's session that would be helpful. And don't forget, we're here next month as well. We'll be doing a webinar next month as well. So if you want to come to that, you'll be more than welcome. But if I can just close by praying for us all, then that would be lovely. Lord God, I thank you so much for the ability to communicate online like this. And thank you that we can even use this on Sundays when there's COVID-19 issues. And I pray that you give us all wisdom to know how to use this technology best. Give us wisdom in our communication. We're so humbled when we look at Jesus in the Gospels and we see, Lord, what a master communicator you were. Absolutely incredible. And we're nowhere near that. We pray you'd help us to grow in how we communicate your Bible, your good news. And we pray just for this Sunday, for any of us who are preaching this Sunday, that you would give us more of your grace, God, to be able to preach your word well and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thanks, Duncan.
It was a pleasure. Take care, everyone.
Cheers.
Thank
All right,
you.
bye.
Bye.
See you next month, Duncan. Yeah.